Okay, I'm just going to wait 2 minutes and then get going. All right, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Okay. I'm Gary Rice, co-chair of the Adult Education Committee here at Congregation Untitled. Today's program with Rabbi Michael Cohen is from the Rabbi Institute for Environmental Sciences in Israel, where probably the roads are not covered with an impossibly thick coat of ice this morning. I'm delighted that Zachary Handlin, a fifth-generation member of our congregation, and himself a recent student at the Institute, has agreed to introduce the program. I know that many of you know Zach, but for those of you who do not, Zach graduated this year at high school and the University of Vermont with a degree in environmental sciences. After graduation, Zach was awarded a Westheimer education grant to study at the Avara Institute, and he has worked in Israel on a couple of other occasions as well, on a kibbutz and in a moshav. One of these days, I'd like to know the difference between a kibbutz and moshav, but that's for another day. Currently, Zach is a second-year student at Vermont Law School, and he has graciously agreed to tell us a bit about his own experiences at the Rabbi Institute to lead us into today's program. So, Zach, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to share my screen and some photos for everyone. You should be seeing that now. So Wadi Arava, it's the valley between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, and translates to mean desolate and dry area. Sand and rock cover nearly every surface, forming majestic mountain ranges and endlessly rolling sand dunes. These rocks contain many stories. They can teach us about ancient civilizations, and they can also teach us about what life existed before humans inhabited the earth. Studying the past helps inform us about the future, and I was fortunate to spend many hours in quarantine walking through the desert, admiring its great many rocks. Another blessing the desert provided during quarantine was a view of some magnificent birds, because during the spring, hundreds of millions of birds of all shapes, sizes, and color make the crossing from Africa to Europe while passing through the Holy Land. Much like in our religion, these birds pass down their knowledge from generation to generation. The desert is home to many forms of life. It's an ecosystem that transcends political borders. Unfortunately, life in the desert is not immune from the actions of Homo sapiens. Even from my remote sanctuary in the desert, I could not escape observing the many impacts that humans are having on the landscape. Climate change, drought, desertification, oil spills, mineral extraction, construction of airports, highways, commercial shipping ports, seaside resorts, and shopping malls, weapons testing, border walls, barbed wire fences, pandemics. These are all threats to life in the desert. But on a more positive note, another thing that I did in quarantine was make pizza and beer, because who doesn't like pizza and beer? I was very lucky to spend my time on Kibbutz Keturah with 50 amazing individuals, amongst whom we shared ideas and stories from our own lived experiences. While we often had a lot of fun, It was not always easy living with people from different cultures, many of which I knew very little about. But when you share the same space with people, you have to learn to coexist, otherwise everyone suffers. This brings me to the topic of today's event, which is the environment as a bridge to peace. Even though today we're not all together in the same room, state, or even country, it's important to remember that our actions do have consequences. Coexistence and peace are not possible unless we can learn to share and adapt to our rapidly changing world. With that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Rabbi Michael Cohen. Rabbi Cohen splits his time between two of my favorite communities, Kibbutz Keturah and Manchester, Vermont. He teaches classes at Bennington College and the Avara Institute on conflict resolution and environmental peace building, often using the Bible as a textbook. I highly encourage everyone to look him up after this event and read some of his thought-provoking articles in JPost and elsewhere on the internet. And with that, I'll pass my screen over to you, Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you, Zach. You're very, very kind in your words. I loved your photos, and it was a wonderful summary that you gave of what we're doing here at the Institute. As you mentioned, we've been dividing ourselves back and forth since the kibbutz opened its doors in 1996, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. I also want to thank Gary for organizing this and the Adult Education Committee of Agudat Achim, and for all of you for being here. I know we're kind of zoomed out in this second year of COVID, so I appreciate you all taking this morning to be with us as it's 5:37 here in the evening. We are also expecting a rainstorm coming in from Sinai, which is always very, very exciting here. And hopefully the electricity will stay on for this, but everyone's very excited about that. We're also updating the generator on the kibbutz. There was actually no electricity from 2 to 5 this afternoon, and it's going to be off for the next couple of days, but it was on for the evening, so we can go forward with all of this. So what I thought we would do, just because it's Zoom and someone's hard to be in front of a screen all the time, is I'll start with, in a moment, showing a short video about the Institute, just to kind of give you an overhead. And then I'll go through a PowerPoint to just give basic information, open it up for question and answer at that point, or your initial questions I'll try to answer. And then I'll kind of do a deeper dive. But when doing the deeper dive, don't wait, we won't wait for the end. If a question comes up as I'm talking, feel free to ask and I'll try to answer it then. So that's kind of, and then I'll have another video also to just kind of break up this view that we have all the time of each other. So does that sound okay for everybody? Okay, I'm seeing naughty heads with 4 people on a couch and Barry Hendelman. That looks like a fun place to be right now. Okay, so let me do share screen. Give me a second here. Zach, can you hear this?
Yeah, I can hear it.
It was founded in 1996 on the premise that environment and cooperation and dialogue and peace are work that has to go together to make our region here in the Middle East a more sustainable and peaceful place for all of us. Our hard work in cross-border environmental diplomacy has brought some successful results. One really notable example of the past year is the sending of 2 atmospheric water-producing devices into Gaza to make drinking water out of the air in hospitals in Gaza. That's a partnership with WaterGen, funded by the EU, that we're very, very proud of.
We believe that cross-border cooperation is the only way to bring sustainability and stability to our region. So in both Gaza and in the West Bank, we are working on the ground, bottom-up, high-impact solutions in the areas of wastewater treatment, renewable energy, food security, training and capacity building, Israelis and Palestinians partnering together.
Climate change is an imminent threat to our region. We're a hotspot for climate change. Environmental work right now is crucial for a sustainable future in Israel, in Palestine, and Jordan, and we're committed to that work.
The environment can't wait for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And by working together on environmental issues that challenge everybody in the region, we're actually building the foundation for peaceful relations and the potential for peace between ourselves and our neighbors in the future.
So I hope that gave you a bit of a sense of what we do. I just want to say one thing. David Lair, who you saw in the video, was our director for 20 years. And it was founded by Alon Tal. David really developed the institute that it is today. And he stepped down after 20 years last year. He's now actually at Boston University this year teaching and doing postdoc work at BU. So if you have any children, grandchildren at BU, you can take a course with him this spring as well. He's teaching 2 courses, including one on Israel, which should be quite fascinating. And his successor is Dr. Tariq Abu Hamid, a Palestinian, who until recently was our academic director and ran our Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation. Tariq is the first Palestinian to run an Israeli academic institute, and we are so proud to have him leading us these days, and I can talk more about Tariq later on as well. So what I thought I would do now is switch to the PowerPoint and again give you a further overview and then open it up for Q&A, and then we'll do a deeper dive. So once again, give me a second here. So much. So this is the Avara Institute for Environmental Studies. As you can see, our logo is both in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. And the tree you see there is the acacia tree. The acacia tree is the essential kind of anchor of life in the Arava Desert. It's also a very, very important biblical tree. The Aaron that the 10 Commandments were carried in was made out of acacia wood. A number of the altars in the Mishkan were made out of acacia wood, and a number of other pieces of the Mishkan were made out of acacia wood. So the acacia tree has biblical importance and very, very importance to the life within the Arava Desert itself. So our mission is to ensure that shared environmental resources of the region are protected, that scarce environmental resources no longer will be the source of conflict, and all that this will lead to environmental cooperation. Our tagline is nature knows no borders. Most days I actually ride my bike to the Jordanian border. We actually saw a wolf on the Jordanian side yesterday. And particularly this time of year when there are clouds, when things at 11, usually the weather goes from west to east. When those clouds are floating from Israel and they cross the Jordanian border, they don't go through passport control. And the water aquifers under the ground at the Israeli-Jordanian border, they don't know what country they're in. And so this notion of the environment transcending these political boundaries is essential for the work and the relationships that we're able to create at the Institute. We have an environmental studies program, which is on the undergraduate level. I'll go into more detail of all of this later on. We have a number of transboundary research programs. It's a community of intent with our students from various countries, all leading towards cross-border cooperation. And then one of I would say the core, even though it's for non-credit of the Institute, is our peace building and leadership seminar. On the academic program, we offer 4 to 5 courses in environmental studies, another 4 or 5 courses in other aspects related to the environment. I actually teach a course on the Bible and the environment. Students are given credit from Ben Gurion University. So if you use as a study abroad from the United States, your credit transfers back from here to whatever institute you are involved in the United States. That's for students who are in college. After you've graduated from college, if you want to come back here, or if you didn't have the opportunity to study with us while we were in college, we have a number of research internships where you get to work mostly with our various research departments, but also with our Center for Environmental Diplomacy. Students work under a faculty member working on a project, but they live with the student body. They can take one course. They do all the environmental touring that we do. And so they're very much integrated into the program as well, and do fascinating research projects. We have a number, as I mentioned, different research institutes, so I'll go into detail with them. One is the Center for Transboundary Water Management, which is run by Dr. Clyde Lichtchen, who's really become one of the world's leaders on cooperation across borders when it comes to water issues. Water can be a source of conflict and it can be a source of cooperation. In this part of the world where we are living in a hyper-arid climate, we get very, very, very little water. Finding ways to reuse water, to save water is essential. We also often work with communities that are off-grid or have very, very low access to electricity. So as you can see, we try to use decentralized gray water treatment and reuse for rural communities. That is to say, we take the gray water, the water from sinks and showers, and treat it. And so it can be reused often for agriculture. Another challenge here is that most of the, I should say, all of the rivers and streams in the area don't know, again, from these borders. They cross Jordan, Israel, Palestine, back and forth. And so if you have a particular river and if you want to restore it, you can't just restore it where you are, because either you're getting the pollution from upstream or you're causing pollution to go downstream. And so there needs to be cooperation. And so from the early years, the Institute's been involved in mapping out these various rivers and working on projects to restore them. The Dead Sea Basin is also critical in this part of the world. As you know, the Dead Sea has been disappearing at the rate of about 1 meter, 3 feet a year for the last couple of decades. And so there are various plans to try to conserve it. And we've been part of those processes as well. The Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation was until recently run by Dr. Tarek Abhamid, who I referenced earlier. If you look at solar radiation maps of this part of the world, some of the highest solar radiation in the world is here in the Arava Valley. And so it makes a lot of sense to be both creating solar fields and doing research in it. The first commercial solar fields for electricity in Israel are actually here on Kibbutz Keturah. Many of you are familiar with, at least have visited Israel, that the Duk Shemesh, where the sun is used to heat water for showers, has been for decades. But it's only been in around the last 10 years or so that Israel has actually used solar power for electricity. And when the Arava Power Company got started, which I can go into more details about that, its first offices were actually held at the Arava Institute. And that room today is still known as the APC room, the Arava Power Company room. So we do a lot of research when it comes to various forms of solar panels, ways of keeping them cooler. Actually, solar panels like the solar light, they don't like to be hot. The hotter they are, they actually are less effective. So we're working on ways to keep solar panels cooler, and other research when it comes to solar. Tarek's actually personal research, which is how I first got in contact with him before he was at Arava, is clean hydrogen energy for cars. And so that's some of the other research that he's involved with here as well, and other projects. Dr. Miri Levy-Neiman runs our Center for Hyper-Arid Socioecology, which this is dealing with focusing on the environmental concerns of the Arava Valley itself, working particularly with Israelis and Jordanians. You can see that acacia tree monitoring is critical. As I said, the acacia tree is the key to all life in the desert here. And if the acacia tree is healthy, the desert is healthy. If the acacia tree is not healthy, the desert is not healthy. You'll see, unfortunately, in the lower left, you'll see some oil in the desert. There was an oil spill in Ein Avrona, which is about 20 kilometers or so south of here a number of years ago, when they were taking the airport out of Eilat and building it further north. And so we were very much involved in both reclamation from the spill and monitoring the spill. It's one of the reasons, one of the things that was agreed to in the Abraham Accords was to run, there's a pipe that had been built when Israel had relations with Iran when the Shah was in power before 1979, so that a pipe could run from Eilat to Ashkelon and bring oil as a shortcut, so you wouldn't have to go to the Suez Canal or around Africa. And under the Abraham Accords, they would like to reopen, Israel and her new allies would like to reopen that pipe. We at the Institute and a number of environmental organizations, they actually fought it for this very reason, of the fear of what would happen if there was a break in the pipe. And just recently, the Israeli Minister of the Environment ruled against building it. So at this stage of the game, it's not going to be built, in part because of the work that we did to prevent that. The Center for Sustainable Desert Agriculture, up until recently, was run by Dr. Elaine Soloway. She's retired. They're still doing research here, and we have a new director, Noah, who is actually back in the States right now, getting married, and he'll be back in a week or two to do that. Elaine is one of the original members, early members of Kibbutz Keturah, and has been involved in agricultural here from the get-go, even before the Arava Institute existed. And when we started in 1996, she joined the Institute. And if you think about a whole swath of the world's surface that lives in conditions of high salinity and low water, it's a lot of people living there. It's really hard to grow crops for food or for medicinal reasons. And she's been doing research in that for decades now. And she's been running our Center for Sustainable Desert Agriculture, looking at various plants, shrubs, and bushes that grow in high salinity, low water, many with medicinal qualities. The marula is a fruit tree that has the highest concentration of vitamin C of any fruit tree in the world. The argani nut has a cholesterol, the oil lowers cholesterol, and it's very, very good for cooking. And actually, her son Nadav is now working on creating that into a for-profit company that we're working with at the Institute, but it was all of that research was first done by his mother, Elaine, as well. Neem, she's also growing, has qualities that are good for teeth. The balm of Gilead, she's planted a number of biblical plants as an antioxidant. And of course, probably most people know about Elaine through the growing of Methuselah, the 2,000-year-old date tree. As in the 1960s, Yigal Yadin was digging at Masada and found a catchment of date seeds. And they ended up at Bar-Ilan University for some reason. The Hadassah Hospital became interested in the Judean date, which no longer exists because they learned that it had medicinal qualities. So Hadassah Hospital was given some of these dates, but doctors at Hadassah Hospital are good at reviving people, but not 2,000-year-old dates. But they knew about Elaine, and so she was given about 4 or 5 of them and put them in a number of different solutions. And one of them, as you know, germinated. Methuselah at the time was the oldest germinated seed in the world. And eventually Methuselah got bigger, was planted outside. The trouble with Methuselah, as with many of the problems in the world, is Methuselah is a male. And we are not going to get any fruit from Methuselah. Elaine was given some other seeds and was able to germinate them. And 2 of them were female, and Hannah was able to eventually be pollinated by Methuselah and produce 600 Judean dates that we haven't seen in 2,000 years. So that's what Elaine in some ways is most famous for, but she's been doing all this other amazing work in sustainable agriculture for years. We also have a research park. If you look at the photos on the top here, you can see these very much look like buildings you would find in other parts of the world, particularly in the 3rd and 4th world. And what we tried to do here is replicate both conditions and the building conditions and building materials that one could use in those parts of the world where you're off-grid. That is, you have no access to electricity from a centralized power system, and you don't have access usually to water from a centralized system as well. And through these different structures that are easily replicated in different parts of the 3rd and 4th world, we've created techniques where people can have electricity, can have lights, can cook, and improve their quality of life as well. In the lower right hand, you can see Methuselah, and in the left here, in the lower left, you can see some of the research that we're doing with solar panels. It's not so clear here, but in some of these panels that are different colors, some of them we actually allow the light can go through. the panel itself, and is another way of researching what's going on there. Our latest kind of invention, if you will, is about 5+ years ago on our, when we were looking at our 20th anniversary, we did an evaluation of strengths and our weaknesses. And one of the things that we came up with was realizing that we've been doing a lot of work on what's called track 2. That is, there's track 1 diplomacy, which would be government diplomats, such as you see Dennis Ross here, the great track 1 diplomat, which I'll get to him in a second. But on the track 2 level, with your non-government organizations, academic institutions, grassroots organizations, on the track 2 level, there's a lot of other dynamics that go on when it comes to diplomacy, if you will. And we realized that we've been doing, at that point, we've been doing it for some 20 years with great successes. And it was kind of chutzpahdik on our part, but we thought, well, maybe we have something to treat the track 1 diplomats. So we launched something called the track 2 initiative that is morphed into applied environmental diplomacy, where we brought together individuals from Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, including Gaza, and are working on a number of different projects in these areas. And we're certainly at our second conference a number of years ago, Dennis Ross, the great track 1 diplomat, came and said, I get it. And he's been writing about this, if you look at some of his readings or his writings of late. He said during Camp David and during the Israel-Egyptian and Israel-Jordanian peace treaties, they forgot about the grassroots. And it is so clear to him, and certainly to us, the importance of track 2 work. And this is what we've been able to do. And it's this latest initiative where we're doing some groundbreaking work both in Gaza and the West Bank in terms of projects on the ground. Damor is our Palestinian partner. Oxford University is part of us. The World Bank, the State Department, the Office of the Quartet, which is the UN branch dealing with peace in this region, and IPCRI, which is one of the more important Israeli-Palestinian organizations, co-run by one of our alum, Leon Mellon. So I'm going to stop sharing screen here, and I want to pause here and see at this point if there are any questions and that I can answer. Murray.
You can have. Yes, my question is, how much or what kind of support do you get actually from the various governments and non-state participants? And how much of the work of the Institute and its results are being let's say, informed in the various territories?
Thank you. So the question is, where do we get our funding from in the big picture? We're very fortunate we get a lot of funding from the US government. One of the bright spots in the kind of dire political scene that we have in the United States right now, in December of last year, at the end of the last Congress, there was a bipartisan bill that was passed, the NOAA, Nita Lowey Middle East Peace Partners Act. It was a bipartisan act, $50 million for each of the next 5 years, $250 million that the US government is investing in programs like ours. We have to apply for it as do the other organizations, but it's a huge lift for the amount of money that the US government has been giving us, and we're hoping it's going to become an international fund, something called the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is an umbrella organization of 150 organizations of Israeli Palestinian NGOs doing similar work on the ground. ALMEP's been working for 10+ years to get this fund through, and we hope it will be an international fund where the Europeans are getting ready to put in money. We hope also that will be $50 million. So it'll actually be $250 million every year going forward. There's other sources within the US government. We've gotten funding. We get funding from the Jewish National Fund. Of course, the Aravans, who we do a bike ride every year as well. We've gotten some funding over the years and from foundations, et cetera. We've gotten funding over the years from the Israeli Ministry of the Environment, and I believe a few other Israeli ministries as well. We haven't gotten funding from Jordan or the Palestinian Authority right now. We're always in conversation with them. We're more excited at this stage of the game with the Abraham Accords is getting funding from the Gulf states. And so that's something that we hope to see going forward. I will say the second year that I was here, it was the second Intifada started. And there was one of our students, Palestinian students, couldn't get out of his town. And so, and the conditions that were getting a bit stressful. So I did a food and medicine drive within the Arava Institute, which I expanded to Kibbutz Kitzurah. And it was a fascinating exercise. It was very rewarding when we met. His name happened to be Tarek also at the border, and was able to give him all of this. But I eventually wrote an article called Feeding the Enemy that I had translated into Arabic that was published in the Al-Quds Palestinian newspaper. And so we would like to have more examples of that in the Palestinian press, and we certainly work on that all the time, but there's lots of other dynamics that are always involved. Any other questions at this stage? Mishka.
Yeah, just a simple one, maybe not. How do you recruit people to be part of this?
Great question.
And a second piece of it is, do students decide which of these participating structures, do they have to decide that in advance? Do they get to switch around? Do they get the full exposure to everything that's going on?
Great, wonderful question. So in the United States, we have a student recruiter. We've had various student recruiters over the years. They travel around the country. Usually once in the fall and once in the spring, they usually travel with 2 or 3 alumni, usually an Israeli Jew and either a Palestinian or a Jordanian or an Israeli Arab. And they go to various campuses. And we certain campuses, we have developed amazing relationships. And there's some colleges that have been sending us students, including the University of Vermont, pretty much since the first year. And so we nurture the ones who keep sending us, and we're always growing. And this is actually one of the ways that anybody here can certainly help us if you have children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews who want to have an amazing, very, very, and sounds trite, but a life-changing experience in Israel. Please send them our way. In Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, we have separate student recruiters for those different countries. What's interesting in Jordan, we often will take out an ad in one of the Jordanian newspapers that say, "Come study the environment in the Arava Valley." The Arava Valley. The Arava Valley is both in Jordan and Israel. The ad doesn't say where in the Arava Valley. With a number to call, when they call the number, it becomes pretty clear where the program is. And at that point, some people drop out. And at that point, there are people who are interested, stay and interested. We then send, they fill out a form. This is all on the web. But then we send members of the staff to interview Jordanian students in Jordan as part of the application process. And then the same thing in Palestine. We have open days where we have Israelis and Palestinians come and visit the Institute as well. So when you come here as a student, you can either come as a student or you can come as an intern. So when you come as an intern, you look at the list of where internships are available in the different research departments and apply for those. When it comes to the academic program, there are a number of courses that are offered each semester. Then you sign up for those courses. So those are how those 2 strands work. I was told to call on somebody next. Let me just see what that is. Oh, the Hannah fruit. I forget the answer. I'm sorry about that. Esther, question.
So I was curious about a couple of things. You talk about solar energy. Does that mean, and you'd had the Dead Sea, you studied the Dead Sea area. Does this mean that more water will be available down the Jordan and other rivers to fill what is now really the dead pools as opposed to the Dead Sea? Even though you said that somehow you need to cool those solar panels, I was just wondering if increased water flow results from that. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, so you're doing all these studies and you're learning about new ways that plants will thrive and all that. And is there any concern about, you're doing studies, but if it grows and grows and grows, are we going to hurt the desert itself?
Okay, great. Great questions there.
That's a good question.
So in terms of the Dead Sea, the main source of the Dead Sea, as you alluded to, was the Jordan River. But over the recent decades, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Jordan have been diverting waters from the Jordan River. And so in an area where you have a high evaporation rate, if you kind of turn off the spigot, the bathtub's going to empty, which is in a sense, that's the dynamic of what's happening in the Dead Sea right now. In the ideal world, the Dead Sea would be, the Jordan River would be restored to its old flow and would fill up the Dead Sea and life would be better. Because one of the things we actually know about the environment, after humans tinker with it, the best thing we can do is allow the environment to go back to how things were. In the world that we live in now, with both the geopolitics and the needs for clean water, that's probably not going to happen, though I will say Friends of the Earth Middle East have really been pushing for that for years. It just doesn't seem there's enough political will in all of those countries to see that happen right now. And so for a while, there was a talk of building the Red Dead Canal, a canal from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. That seems to be going nowhere. And so right now we're kind of in a holding pattern. As you alluded to, the bottom half of the Dead Sea are really evaporation ponds used by both Jordan and Israel to extract minerals. That has its own environmental degradation. I will say on sidebar, one of our dreams is the future minister of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan will be the environmental ministers of these countries, will be our alumni. And years ago, there was one of our alumni, his name is Rabbi, and he was working on this quasi-Israeli government organization to try to address the issues of the Dead Sea. And he was at work one day, and one day his boss said, I really wish I could talk to my counterpart across the sea in Jordan. And Rabbi had spent, a year at the Arab Institute, and said, well, why is that difficult? And he picks up the phone, and he calls up one of the Arab Jordanian alumni, who picks up the phone, who calls the office there, and they have this conversation. And that's the model of the kind of cooperation and the work that we hope to do going forward. But I don't want to present any rosy picture about the Dead Sea, unfortunately. I would love to, but I don't. When it comes to the solar, like I said, the solar panels, the photovoltaics, they love the light from the sun, but they don't like the heat from the sun. One way that we're learning to cool it is, again, with these the solar panels, if you allow the light to go through and it can grow plants, plants cause humidity. Humidity cools the air a bit. So that's one way that we're looking to cool the solar panels, which then they produce more electricity. And so that's one of the ways that we're looking at that. Yeah, I mean, we all know, David Ben-Gurion said, let's make the desert bloom. And there is something, very romantic about that and something very important about that. But one of the things that we've learned over the years, and Alon Tal, wrote about this in his book, Pollution in the Promised Land, the Zionist movement got smarter as the decades rolled on. And we realized that a desert is a desert because a desert is an ecosystem unto itself that is part of the larger mosaic of the world's ecosystem. And so as we do work in the desert, there's been a much more of an awareness of what those limits should also be. And so that's definitely being taken into consideration more than it was clearly in the past, the earlier iterations of the Zionist movement. So, we learn. One thing I will also say in terms of that, there's, and I don't want to enter this, but I know in the political discourse in the United States and other parts of the world, there's a lot of critique of Israel. And I'm certainly, as a Zionist who love Israel, I have my own critiques of Israel. But I will also say this about all of that. Israel's 70 years old. When the United States was 70 years old, we were in 1847. We haven't even fought our civil war yet. And we haven't even finished that war in some ways. So I think
To give you a link.
It's just a way of him teasing me with the answer. Yeah.
Lost you.
You have to reconnect.
All right, so I'll send you the email.
I can also take some questions if anyone has some for me. While we wait.
Thank you. Thanks, Zach. Why don't you do that? And I'm gonna send Rabbi an email. Jack, what should I tell him to do? Just to log in again?
He needs to come back in. He's already out. So I'm waiting to see him come back in. If Zach wants to take questions, go for it.
Actually, do you mind, Zachary, if I ask you a question, which I know part of the answer, but we really haven't done a deep dive into this. But one of the things that from your time spent at the Institute, you came back and you had a different perspective than you had all along in your Jewish education.
Zach is taking questions.
Alongside people from Jordan and Gaza. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising things when I got there was realizing how little I knew about the other cultures that share the region that we were studying in. I mean, we talk so much about two-state solution, one-state solution, like all of these solutions that we've thrown out there, but we're really having those conversations amongst ourselves in our community here in upstate New York. And so I was very surprised about how little I knew about the other people whose families date back to the land of Israel for 10 generations, but who live in Palestine or in Jordan, and they haven't been able to access their families' homes, who lived there before 48. So that was just a very surprising thing for me. And I think something we could definitely improve upon in our own educations in Hebrew school. Yeah, does that answer the question?
That provides definitely some insight. One of the questions I had for the professor was, I wonder if if they see any of this resulting in increased support, any power of a voting bloc, because they're developing a following, so to speak, or is it one of those situations where they really kind of have to fly under the radar because of these collaborations?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some flying under the radar there. Tarek, the new director of the Institute, when I was there, he flew to the US and spoke at APAC, and I was talking to him after the fact, and I was like, how do you explain some of the hard conversations that we're having in our peace building seminars to people who are very, are very strong Zionists, and who may not want to hear that we're working with Arab students. And he said that, yeah, he does sometimes have to modify what he's the way he presents the Institute and the way he presents like the research that we're doing, depending on the audience. So that's just kind of the reality. When I was studying there is a lot of anti-Arab sentiments. There was graffiti written on some of the buildings, saying really nasty things about the Arab students that were there. So that is a reality. And we took a peace building trip to Jerusalem, and we visited a school that has Palestinian and Israeli students learning together. And that school has also been vandalized and burned down by extremists. So that there is a reality that there's a conflict going on, and that can be difficult. And now I just realized I forgot the question. Sonia, do you have a question?
Yes, I did have a few questions. First of all, do you work with Kibbutz Lotan at all?
Sorry, you're cutting out. I can't hear you.
Do you work with Kibbutz Lotan? I know they're in the Arava desert and they're based on environmental technology as well.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part one more time?
Do you work with Kibbutz Lotan?
Yes.
Lotan.
Yeah, I visited Kibbutz Lotan. They do a lot of great permaculture studies and workshops, mud building. So they build with the sand and water and straw, combine them all together, and they build their houses out of mud, which is, really cool to visit and see how they've used just like the surroundings of the desert, which seems like not a lot sometimes. And when you're walking around there, you feel like you're walking in a jungle, not in a desert, because they've just done some really great things with, drip irrigation, water reclamation. Yeah, it's a great kibbutz. I wasn't able to spend a ton of time there because of the pandemic, but I did get a tour towards the end.
So what would you consider Rabbi calling his telephone, so he's aware that there's a problem that has to do with the rainstorm, I guess, and he expects to be back shortly.
I'm back. Yeah, it's quite exciting when you have a rain with thunder in the desert. And what will happen is tomorrow, a lot of people are going to jump in their cars and Jeeps and look for waterfalls, look for areas where the water collects. So first of all, we need it for life here in the desert. We don't get a lot of rain, but it also makes for very, very exciting sighting. So I apologize for that, but I can actually hear the thunder. So I'm glad we reconnected, and I thought to put Gary's phone number in my smartphone. Also, the other thing in terms of calling Gary was not expensive. We pay $10 a month for unlimited calls to Israel and the United States. And what happens when you break up phone monopolies? Sidebar, sorry about that. Okay, who's next with questions?
Natalie Oceans.
Natalie, please.
Something, do you also, you talked about recruiting students, are you also recruiting faculty, and what kinds of faculty, and how successful?
I couldn't hear that. Could you ask, or could someone re-ask that question, please?
I'll type it in the chat.
He has a weird audio
Is
system.
that spelled right?
Don't worry about spelling.
Is that right?
We're not muted.
Natalie, you're muted.
She's writing something.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Oh, great. Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Is the program open to retired age people also, or just student age?
That's a great, it's interesting. The first year of the program, we had a woman in her 70s or 80s. I don't know whether we have restrictions now, but if you write to me, actually, I should put my email here for everybody. So let me do that. I can follow up with that.
Okay.
There, so everyone's got my email. Feel free to do any follow-up questions.
Friends
Um,
of. Okay.
friendsofArava.org. Rabbi Michael at friendsofArava.org. So the question about recruiting faculty is actually one of the things that we looked into 5 years ago, where it was to have more Arab faculty members and more women. And we've improved, but there's still room for a lot of improvement. I will say though about the staff of the Arava Institute, with the exception of myself and Tarek, everybody are women on the staff of the Institute. So when it comes to the staff, we've actually better, beyond better. But when it comes to faculty, there's still work to do. Any other questions? Then I can move on, but I'm always happy to take questions. Okay, so let me carry on a bit. And as I'm going through this section, if a question comes to mind while I'm talking, just ask it. I'm looking at my notes, so I will not see the chat or the screen. So Gary, if you see someone who has got a question or raise their hand, just let me know. So just to reiterate, the raison d'etre of the Institute is to form a cadre of environmental leaders for the Middle East, and by extension, the rest of the world. We teach students today so nations will work together tomorrow. The Institute, as I mentioned, was founded in the fall of 1996 by Dr. Alon Tal, who's one of the leading environmental lawyers and activists in Israel. He was a member of the kibbutz at the time, and they asked him to think of some kind of area where the kibbutz could expand, where it employs people. And at first he thought about something with horses, but that didn't work. And so then he came up with the Arava Institute, really in the wake of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty that had been signed in 1994, literally just down the road from the kibbutz in the Arava Valley on the Israeli-Jordanian border. And there was still the Oslo peace process. And Alon really felt it was incumbent that there would be a regional center where Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, and others could come together to be trained as environmental leaders for the region. I was leading the idyllic rabbinic life not too far from you at Manchester Center, Vermont. It was my 7th year, and my congregation actually gave me an 11-month sabbatical. I was going to go to Jerusalem and do the classic Rabbi Jerusalem thing. The apartment we had lined up, the agreement fell through, and so in February of 1996, I was reading the International Jerusalem Post, and this little ad appeared one day that said, Arava Institute for Environmental Studies opening, fall 1996, contact Dr. Alon Tal with his email address. I had just got an email 2 weeks earlier. I mean, it was, early 1996, that revolution was just starting. Long story short, 4 months of emails going back and forth, and they took a chance on us and we took a chance on them. And we arrived for the first year of the Institute, and I quickly discovered an address for so many of my passions. The Institute is about peace, it's about the environment, it's about cross-cultural learning, it's about living on a kibbutz, living in the desert. Though I will admit, I also do like the Green Mountains and I do like snow. And it really is also, I would argue, the best of what Zionism has to offer. So I was very fortunate to find an address for so many of my passions. And so we've been going back and forth since 1996, coming here anywhere for stays from 6 months to 2.5 years. We were going to be here a full year this year, but because of Corona, we had to shorten it. We got here in November, and we're going to be here through July. And after our second visit in 2001, I opened up the first Friends of Arava office in our house in Manchester Center, Vermont. Now, of course, there's an office in Boston with an executive director, Miriam May, and a staff, and so on and so forth. But that's how that piece got along. Our student body ideally is made up of 1/3 Israeli Jews, 1/3 Arabs, meaning Israeli Arabs, Jordanians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Tunisians, Moroccans, and then 1/3 from the rest of the world, mostly from the United States. And we find that is a really important mixture to have in terms of the dynamics of what the students and the interns go through. As I also mentioned, the interns work with various research departments within the program, and so they're able to work in water, in geohydrology and renewable energy, oil spill reclamation, and biodiversity. As Zach mentioned, only 500 million birds twice a year fly from Africa north, and then half a year later they come back. So there's a lot of work to do when it comes to birds. We have maxed out now at our population we can have at the Institute on our campus. It was mostly built by the JNF, including our present offices, which are some of the old turkey coops of the kibbutz that we refurbished. The turkey coops, there actually are, the walls are made of straw bales of hay, mud, and then linseed oil. They're very thick, narrow windows, so they're made to keep the building as warm as possible in the winter and as cool as possible in the summer. And the dorms are also made specially for the desert climate. But we've maxed out, at least until Corona last year, at 60 students and interns. So we actually made a decision last year to start building a new campus. We've gotten permission from the kibbutz to build a whole new campus in the southwest corner of the kibbutz. So we will eventually go from 60 to 90 to 120 to eventually 150 students and interns. And for me, that really speaks of the interest that people have in the work that we do. I would say the proof of the pudding of our work in many ways is really our alumni. And we see in our alumni long-term, both personal and professional relationships. We have an alumni peace and environmental network. There's a Facebook page where they're constantly posting information about what they're doing, asking for help from each other. We have a conference every year that our alumni attend. And we also see them involved in some very, very important work. Two alumni, Rina Kedem, and is Israeli Jewish, and Suleiman Khalasa, who is a Jordanian Christian, came together 2 or 3 years ago to form JISR. JISR, the abbreviation stands for the Jordan-Israel Center for Community, Environment, and Research. JISR happens to be also the word in Arabic for bridge. That Rina and Suleiman looked at the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty and realized lots of it actually talks about the Arava Valley, and it talks about both environmental cooperation and tourist cooperation, and not enough was being done in that area. And so they created this organization where they are working on revamping or strengthening that aspect of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. And a sidebar of it is that they are and we are in conversations with opening a campus in Aqaba, Jordan, of the Arava Institute. But there's again an initiative of 2 of our alumni. Maya Negev and Ala Obid have done work together in the Galil Society on work at the climate crisis. Anton Kalila and Jor Ben Ami form an organization called Compassionate Conversation, Israelis and Palestinians working on conservation when it comes to animals in the land. Liel Magam, who I mentioned earlier, is the co-director of the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information. Many of you probably follow Gershom Baskin in the Jerusalem Post. He founded IPCRI years ago, and when he left, Liel became the Israeli co-director along with the Palestinian co-director as well. Ikram Salah, it's a wonderful story. On one of our earlier visits here, she came here, she's Palestinian, wears the hijab, very religious, and had very, very little English. And my wife, Allison, who has worked at the Institute most of our visits, was tutoring her in English that year. We came on a later visit, and we got to see Ikram present the results of her doctoral work in English at Ben-Gurion University. And she's done some very, very important research on a particular bug that causes a particular fly that causes disease in the desert, and particularly in the Palestinian community. Hila Ackerman, another alum, was the head of the environment for Herzliya, and also Ramat HaNegev, and a couple of other alumni that are doing important work. We have Eve, who's working in the Negev coexistence, again, Bedouins and Israeli Jews working on coexistence in the northern Negev. As you know, Alon Tal has been elected to the Knesset, and Shimri, an Arava alum, is now kind of his right-hand person in the Knesset as well. And we have a number of, I could go through other examples, but I really think that you get a sense here of some of the important work that our alumni are doing. And as I mentioned, our dream is that the future minister of the environment for Israel, Palestine, and Jordan will all be graduates of the program. I want to talk now about our PEL sessions, or Peace Building Leadership Seminar. So in the early years of the Institute, we assumed that, oh no, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to show another video because I've been talking too much. So let me show a video. We'll take some questions and then I'll talk about PELs. So I'm going to do a share screen again here. Just give me a second.
The shelter garden was established to protect rare and endangered species from the area, and also to establish areas which are particularly good as reservoirs for these plants. It's not enough just to protect one plant. You have to have a population of them, so you have enough genetic diversity to go on.
A flyway of millions of birds passes through southern Arava. Birds passing from Africa into Europe and Asia and back are funneled into this bottleneck of migration, and these birds need our help. In the past, they used to stop over in natural habitats such as salt marshes and desert, but drainage canals and destruction of habitats push them into man-made habitats. Even these man-made habitats are important assets for these migratory birds. Diversity of plants is a key factor for being a good stopover site for these migratory birds to fly safely home for breeding.
The Pithosibelium tree, we have several of these, and these are very good for the birds because they have a sort of spiral-shaped fruit, which the birds like to eat. Behind us are many incense trees, such as Boswellia sacra and Commiphora gillidensis, also very good for the birds because the birds will be able to eat their product. Not too far from us are the neem and the argania, which are prime nesting grounds. The argania is especially wanted by birds because it's very thorny, and the animals that might attack the nest cannot get up. And the neems, of course, are good for nesting because they are very, very high. Behind us again here, you can see a acacia tree, and we hope to establish a blind there. People will be able to stand and sit behind and watch the birds as they come down to drink. This is a nice area for the birds because the trees are planted relatively close together, and we still have a lot of open space here to fill up, which I think will be very good for them.
The project of the shelter garden is really, really important for here because this is a project that keeps nature in all the systems of the nature, from the base, from the rocks and the soils and the flora and the fauna, and part of the fauna is on the ground, another part is in air, and all the systems are coming together and will come together in this garden.
My name is Amelia. I come from the United States, and I studied here in the Arava Institute. I really appreciated Elaine Soloway's class on sustainable agriculture. One of the things I really enjoyed about her class was learning about the shelter garden near Kibbutz Keturah. In the shelter garden, there are many species of native and biblical trees and plants. They're really interesting to learn about, and they're also beautiful. What I really appreciate them about the most and about Elaine's work is that she's developing trees and crops that can adapt to climate change and produce an income for these communities in a more sustainable way.
The shelter garden for endangered species is part of our overall approach to nature in this area. Nature knows no borders, and the shelter garden is an example of how we are working to preserve the flora and fauna of this delicate ecosystem, an arid land ecosystem which has some endemic species and plants and crops that aren't found anywhere else in the world. It's also an important part of our efforts to support communities in the region and develop ecotourism as an important part of our economic foundation for sustainability in the Arava.
Rabbi Cohen?
Yep. Any questions now? I guess there's some questions.
There's a couple in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know any. Esther, I see your question about the Avara Institute and the Paulo Solar. Not that I'm familiar with, not that I know of. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We've done some stuff with the University of Arizona, but I'm not sure about that project. If you want to send me some information about it, I'd be very interested. I could easily pass it along. When is the campus expansion planned to be completed? There's no hard date on that. And we're doing this in stages. We're going to first go from 60 to 90, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years, and then kind of see how that plateaus out, and then make decisions going forward. And so we have that long-term goal. We really want to do this in stages and see if it makes sense. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I think those are those two. Any other questions? Did I miss anybody so far? Mishka.
Are these plantings done across the borders, or are they just within the borders of the Institute and Israel?
Actually, the argon, the argani that I spoke about and Elaine spoke about, and that her son is turning into a crop here, that developed through cooperation between Israel and Morocco. And actually, Elaine went to Morocco and got some of those plants and brought them to be planted and researched. I believe some of the work of Jisr, but I'm not sure, but I believe some of the work with Jisr is also about working with some of those plants across the border in Jordan as well. Any other questions? Yes, we love to have visitors. Always, write to us so we can make sure, we've got someone who can show you around. But literally right next to the Institute is the Karen Kolot. It's also an education center, but it's also a bed and breakfast. And so very, very nice accommodations, literally next to the Institute. And they can also arrange for tours of the Institute as well as touring in the region. So yeah, it's called Karen Kolot. Let me put that in the thing here to everybody. Yeah, so that's where you can stay next to us. Okay, let me carry on, because I want to talk about a very important dynamic. And again, I'm not seeing it at all the screens now, so if there's a question that comes up, Gary, please let me know. So as I mentioned, the Institute was founded in 1996. In the early years of the Institute, we assumed that informal conversations would take place between Israelis and Palestinians, and they did. When the second Intifada hit in fall of 2000, and we were actually here, it was our second visit here, it became very, very clear that we needed to create a safe place where the really difficult questions and issues could be confronted. And so Michelle Shachar, who was a member of the Institute at the time, created something called Peace Building Leadership Seminar, where we allow the students to, again, in a safe place, address all of those very, very difficult issues. And students will leave those sessions angry, screaming, crying. But at the end of the day, we see both these amazing long-term personal professional relationships, or even an hour after a really intense session, you'll see them together in the communal dining room, laughing and talking together. And I would argue that it happens because of 5 pieces that really massage the experience of the students here. 3 of them have to do with location. I'll start with those. The first is the program happens to be on Kibbutz Keturah. And if any of you know about Kibbutz Keturah, it was founded by the Young Judea Zionist Youth Movement of the United States of North America. The kibbutz was established right after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And its founders kind of brought the best of American pluralistic democratic Zionism when they established the kibbutz. And that is to say, this is one of the few communities in Israel where intentionally you have both religious and non-religious Jews living together. And it understands the importance of pluralism and the challenges of a pluralistic community. So it's interesting, you have the Rabbi Institute that is this incredibly pluralistic community of Israelis, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Jordanians, et cetera, Americans, living together in a community that already understands the importance of diversity within communities. And that makes it a very comfortable place for the Institute to find itself. I will say, sidebar, when the kibbutz was also founded and they were dreaming of what they hoped would be at the Institute in the years to come, one was to have some kind of education centers. This was also part of the dream of the kibbutz when it was first started, that be something like this here. So we have the location of being on Kibbutz Keturah itself. There's also being here in the desert. And I think you saw in some of the pictures that Zach showed and then some of the things that I showed that we're here in the middle of nowhere. And there's something very calming and quiet about the desert. Much of the conflict takes place in what we call the Merkaz, or the center. And there's a lot more tension there. And here, particularly because of the desert, there's a very calming quality to where you are. And again, that the place, you have the kibbutz, you have the desert. And the third aspect of location is actually the Middle East itself. Part of the problem with this conflict is that nobody knows their neighbors. Israelis don't know Palestinians, Palestinians don't know Israelis, Israelis don't know Jordanians, et cetera. So one of the great things that happens on the weekends here at the Institute is that students get to go home to each other's communities, to their families. And unfortunately, since the very, very early years of the Institute, there's been a very strong voice in Jordan, not the government, but within the people, not to support the peace treaty for a whole bunch of historical reasons. And so these Jordanians who come here are very, very brave, but I've heard this story over and over and over again, where a Jordanian student brings some of his Israeli and North American Jewish classmates back home and introduces them to his family. And his family falls in love with these students. And at the end of the day, they're talking to their parents, and their parents says to them, you know, I learned something today. I have something more in common with the Israeli Jew than the American Jew. Yeah, because they live in the Middle East just like you do. And so we're able to break these barriers down because this program takes place in the Middle East. Now, there is something for taking people, like Seeds of Peace, taking students, Israelis and Palestinians to Maine, or you take people to Italy or Cyprus. There's something getting out of the pressure cooker, and there's an important dynamic there. I don't want to lessen that, but what's really important is people need to get to know each other's neighbor. And so the fact that we're located on Kibbutz Keturah with all the values it brings, that we're in the calming effect of the desert, and that we're located in the Middle East, those 3 locations massage the experience of the students here. But then there are 2 other dynamics that are also, I would argue, are critical. One is time. Our students are together 24/7 for at least 4 months. If they come here for a full year, they're together for 8-9 months. If Many will then go on to do graduate work at Ben Gurion University. We have a cadre of always about 10 alumni at the State Boker campus of Ben Gurion University. But when they're here 24/7. And the luxury of time means when you're having those intense discussion in Pels, you don't have to answer it immediately. You know, you've got time later on, a week or two later, when you can say to Shulamit, you said really made me angry. What did you mean by that? Or Muhammad, I can't believe you said what you said. Can you explain what you meant? We have the luxury of time. The luxury of time also means that we have these other touch points besides the conflict. If this is purely an organization about peace, I'm not sure we would have survived the Second Intifada. But we have these other touch points. They're taking classes together, they're hiking together, they're cooking together, they're sharing their religious holidays together, they're sharing their music together. Time allows for these other moments to see each other. It also means that David's the guy who gets up at 5 in the morning every day and goes jogging. Or Suleiman cooks really, really great kanafe. They get to know each other as individuals as well. But the luxury of time of meeting each other and not having to answer the difficult questions immediately, it builds, as David Lair says, probably one of the most missing ingredients in this conflict is trust. Because if you trust somebody by getting to know them, you may vehemently disagree with them on issues, but you can still imagine going forward to try to solve it. And that is invaluable to the work that we do and what really needs to happen on a larger scale in this part of the world. And finally, the fifth element is the environment itself. When we look at the land here, which is what the conflict's about from the perspective of geopolitics, we see lines, borders, walls, and divisions. When we look at that exact same piece of real estate from the perspective of the environment, those divisions are pushed aside. And we're not just invited, you're forced to work with the other. And that's the magic of what the environment does when we look at it from a different angle, or the land, when we look at it from the sense of geopolitics and not from the environment. So those 5 elements, the program is on Kibbutz Gitzurah with all the values it brings. We're in the calming effect of the desert. We're here in the Middle East so you can get to know each other. We have time to work through issues. And we look at the land from the perspective of the environment and not geopolitics. All of that massages the experience of the students here so that we see these amazing personal and professional relationships that come out of the Institute. You may remember Bobby Kennedy, the great American politician, who, by the way, people forget he was assassinated because of his support of Israel. Bobby Kennedy was one of the casualties of this conflict that people often forget. But he used to quote George Bernard Shaw, who would say, "There are those who look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." For 25 years, the Arava Institute has been answering that question in the positive. That's why I keep returning over and over again, because of that positive answer. And as Leonard Cohen reminds us, our Canadian neighbor to the north, when he's saying, "Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And that's the message. We bring in that light where people sometimes forget there's no light. I do want to mention there are ways you can get involved in us. We have a Beyond Borders tour of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan with very, very high level individuals that we meet with. That's coming March 27th to April 6th. Many of you know we do a bike ride every year. We start in Jerusalem and make our way down to Eilat, including a day here at the Institute, Shabbat break in Mitzpeh. That's November 1st through 8th this coming year. Send us students, and of course you can always support us financially, either directly or through the JMF. So I want to thank you all for being here, but I do want to close with more time for questions if you have any more questions of what I just said. Oh, there's a lot of the chat here I missed. So let me take a look at some of those. But are there any questions there in the chat? And if you do, just raise your hand and please ask.
There are a couple in the chat.
How do you have advocates among the population on both sides of the border, so to speak, who spread the word about the work and the results of the work that are available to all the peoples, and regardless of their political views.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's our alumni who are our best ambassadors. And, over and over again, when, we ask a student, how did you hear about us? It's often through a relative or a friend of theirs who had come here and then told them about it. And so they're constantly spreading the word about their experiences here, which again says something about the value that they really, we say you become part of the Arava family. Like when you graduate from here, we had graduation last week. That's not the end of your relationship to the Arava Institute or the people who you studied with. It's only the next chapter. And so we really see these long-term effects. And again, they are often our best ambassadors in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, and the United States for the work that we do.
Zachary, if he keeps up.
Any other questions?
If there are no more questions, Ronald, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you here.
Oh, and I think Joel has a hand up. One sec. We have time for one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm Dara, by the way. I actually took a seminar with the Arava Institute this past spring at Mount Holyoke College, and it was great. Talked about a lot of renewable energy, and there was definitely a huge diversity within, the attendees. That was really cool to see. But I was first introduced to the Arava Institute through USY's Israel pilgrimage, the L'Takhen Olam program. And I said it in the chat, but they took the volunteers to Kibbutz Keturah and the Arava Institute, showed us around, and while we stayed there, we helped and volunteered. And that was pretty cool, and introduced me to the Avara Institute. And, it's still someplace that I want to go and study abroad. But, potentially if you have grandkids that are interested in this, that like volunteering, maybe have them consider USY LTO, but, it's a great place, great program. So just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Dara.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful program. Zach.
Have a good day, everyone.
Zach, it was really terrific to meet you. Jack Minster always deserves thanks for keeping Zoom programs going. Zach, if you want to say anything further?
No, just want to thank everyone for joining in this morning.
Thank you, Zachary.
Thank you, Zach.
Yes, thanks, Zach.
Zach, is that your fan club in the right corner there? All those people on the couch?
That would be them.
Here and here.
A serious posse.
A few of the screens.
Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you again at another Untitled program. Good morning.